Thank you all for coming to this event. Welcome. It's nice to have you all here. I begin with something of a disadvantage. The talk I'm trying to give here is actually accepted from my second book, which I'm holding here. So it's part of a very large argument, and I'm not going to be able to present all the argument in 30 minutes. So I'm going to do a slide run through and punctuate that with text, in the slides. So the basic issue that I'm dealing with right now is about the question of the canon of African art. How has this canon been formulated? What are its constituent works? More importantly, how does the canon support or prevent the emergence of new works from being considered as canonical in African culture? And what this means in essence is basically the distinction between African artworks that were taken out of the continent and are now present in global museums all over the world, and the continued existence in Africa of cultural properties that have equal antiquity but are not recognized as being authentic because they are in Africa. So this then it becomes a fairly diabolical catch-22. How do you, if you found an authentic African artwork in Africa, how do you prove that it's an authentic piece when it's actually, So in a situation where that should not be an issue, I mean, it would be problematic to not find authentic African artworks in Africa. But somehow, just the mere presence of actually being in Africa works against the so-called, canonicity, authenticity of the work. So, needless to say, I found this initially mirthful and then increasingly exasperating. And after a while, I decided maybe it's time to do something about it. So the project that I ended up doing, which resulted in this book, is actually the first significant effort to document and critically engage a collection of African art that's located on the African continent. And in this case, it's a collection of art from Nigeria, which is recognized worldwide as having one of the significant art traditions in the world, and not just in Africa. So the issue of African collectors and the canon of African art is a fairly straightforward issue. I evaluate the material process of formalizing and interpreting such collections with the goal of defining how they might be incorporated into a context of African art studies in which they are currently invisible. African collectors of African art face a major problem of scholarly validation because their collections circulate outside of established Western systems of representation. And their constituent artworks are often automatically suspected as fakes, contemporary reproductions, or otherwise poor examples of known archetypes. This being a blanket dismissal that is not supported by any engagement whatsoever. It's not that these works have been studied and found to be fake, it's just that there is this general assumption about them. So as a result of such perceptions, African art studies and the art market in general frame the production of value for African art as an exclusively Western process, and also assumes that for African artworks to gain any discursive or fungible value, they must be held in a Western collection and circulate within Western context of knowledge production. So in using the Femi Akinsoye African Art Collection to engage this issue, my interest is simply to look at the idea of the canon and how one might actually add works, to the canon or have the canon engage with other works that could be equally authentic. The critical reception of African art initially unfolded within the museum context, and their international reception as art objects was tied to the increasing value of African artworks of proven antiquity, which were collected pretty much using the kind of strategies that's just been described very eloquently by the previous speaker in quite a fantastic presentation, I might add. The early period of African art studies focused on analysis of archetypal forms and styles within the social context of indigenous African cultures. Since then, a canon of African art has emerged, and its constituent artworks are now established as primary reference in analysis. This canon is exemplified in the 1995 exhibition of African art at the Royal Academy in London. Any person who works in our field will remember that was a very major show when it took place. The artworks included in this exhibition and its catalog, though contentious, have secured iconic status in analysis. And the canon has also generated significant scholarship, and that's something that can be listed ad nauseum. Professors and scholars in my field have actually done a huge amount of work, not only to engage African art in terms of its representation in the West, but more importantly in terms of its value and meaning and importance within the African contexts of its production. So it would then seem rather counterintuitive that in a context in which this amount of work is being done, and quite significant work by very, very astute and capable scholars, that almost all the publications that come out, almost all the exhibitions of African art actually deal with a very small number of works that continue to circulate among themselves. So this was the primary issue I was looking at. What is the meaning and impact of this kind of circulation? How have these works achieved this kind of iconic status? What do they say actually about cultural practice? One of the key things that has not been taken into proper consideration in my field is that the African artworks that were collected during the colonial period did not represent, they were not examples of particular styles of production over time. They were actually examples of historical types of production at a very given period, which is the period in which they were collected. But somehow they've been made to stand in for the entire expanse of African cultural production, which makes it impossible to then look at both the historical context of earlier productions or the emergence of new forms that may have changed the ways that these works are seen and represented. So the primary problem I then faced in writing my book and in looking at the Akisoya collection, the reason why I actually decided to work on the collection were these two artworks that I'm showing on the screen. They are both sculptures by Olowe of Ishe, who is considered to be one of the most significant Yoruba sculptors of the 20th century. And Olowe's works are pretty much as canonical as you can get. And the idea that Olowe sculptures could actually be in a collection in Nigeria where, there are very few, and the museums that have original Olowes, have objects of great value. So I was confronted with a simple question: how do you prove the authenticity of a newly discovered Olowe? No new Olowe has been published since Rosalind Walker's book, Olowe of Ishe, was published by the Smithsonian Institution. The other thing were these two sculptures, which are bronze sculptures from the Edo Kingdom of Benin, representing the Prime Minister of the Benin King, the Iyase, which is the formal title. In 1897, the British government invaded Benin City and cleared out 6 centuries worth of cultural artifacts from the king's palace. This was literally the national wealth of the kingdom. The Benin Kingdom had traded with the West since 1482, when the Portuguese made landfall in Benin. And for the intervening years between 1482 and 1897, the kings spent about 60% of the national income importing bronzes from Europe that was used to make many of the artworks in question. So these were not casual productions. This is actually a calculated, collection by the Benin kings that spanned, several centuries. But the interesting thing is, when the works were taken away, they were recognized as being very significant pieces, and immediately they changed, anthropological analysis of African art, and were quite instrumental in, defining the emergent field of anthropology in Europe. But the problem that arose from the British loot of Benin City was not just that the works were taken away, but that every single production of bronze work in Benin City from 1897 onwards was deemed to not be authentic because it did not belong to that hoard that was stolen. So authenticity in Benin artworks, or the canon of Benin art that's regarded as authentic, ironically, are only those works that can be traced back to that loot of Benin City in 1897 by the British, mainly because these works were then documented, photographed, and sort of they entered into the museum system of classification. So in encountering original artworks from Benin City, and I know a little bit about that because I am related to the Benin Kings, by birth. So I am actually familiar with Benin bronze work and the Guild of Bronze Casters who produced these works. And when I saw these two pieces, I realized they were very definitely old pieces that would have come from the end of the Overanwe dynasty that was overthrown in 1897. But there is a ferocious battle unfolding in African art history about whether there are authentic Benin artworks outside of the hoard that's in the Western collections. So again, this became an interesting issue, and this was what I then decided to tackle. It then occurred to me that basically the issue here is that a lot of artworks, held in African collections have not been published, and therefore they just don't emerge into the discourse. Now, some of these are works that are held in actually organized collections, like the Femi Akinsoya collection, which is not just a random aggregate of objects. This is a collector in a classical sense of the term. He buys from auctions, he buys from local traders and dealers. He competes with other collectors to get the best works, and he's very well read and learned in the field. And then there are the other collections, like my family's collection of title staffs, for instance, which spans 6 generations, and the oldest object of which dates back to the 1840s. And this is something that's in my family's house. They're still pretty much in my grandfather's shrine house in the room he died in, over 30 years ago. And none of these objects have been moved around. They're just there. So if I were to go in there and bring out the ivories and bring out the sculptures, there will still be this problem of being able to prove the authenticity, to the field. And of course, my family is not alone in this. So I decided that the best way would be to look at the organized collection of the Akinsoya collection and then do all the standard and necessary work that's relevant, the kind of work we do for every other collection in order to actually determine which of the collection, objects are significant. So the slides I'm going to be showing you are part of the objects that are from that collection, these various sculptures. And you can see that he's conforming to the classical understanding of African art as sculptural objects, isolated from the general social use value and represented in what might be called a museum context. Some of these works are extraordinary examples that are much better than many of the pieces that are in museums, and I've seen a lot of museum collections. I have shown these works to all the experts in my field who work in the specific areas, and they acknowledge, the significance of the finds. This Ogbechie sculpture on the left here is one of a few examples that can actually be tracked to a particular artist who was working in the Benue in the early 20th century. This yoke mask, vertical mask here, is one of only 23 known examples that are actually, dateable and trackable back to a very specific social context of their origin. So you've got this very wide range of significant objects. These Ugonna Choma pieces from Nsukka are the only known examples in any collection anywhere that I know of. Ugonna Choma as a category is quite common, but most of the ones you find in museums come from the Oka region, which is different from these ones that come from the northern Igbo in the Nsukka region. So as we can then see from the analysis that we've been doing in the field, a recently published book points out that while the story of the ascent of African art from curiosities to artifacts have been told many times, the continuation of the story in the second half of the 20th century is not quite as familiar. This is kind of astonishing because, of course, this period was the heyday of collecting African traditional or classical figurative sculpture. So it is at once odd and notable that the story of African collectors of indigenous African art doesn't factor into this narrative at all. The invisibility is enforced by several systemic factors. One of the major factors, which has been described by Charles Gore in talking about Benin art, is that sorry, excuse me. Only castings of the pre-colonial era are seen or thought to bear the imprimatur of authenticity and legitimacy. And the arbitrary canon, in essence, that excludes multitudes of authentic forms of indigenous aesthetics, enables African art collecting to be framed mainly as an activity that operates, in the West and completely excludes Africa. This moves the conversation away from art history into the economics of cultural patrimony, because what we're dealing with here then is a massive transfer of cultural wealth and cultural equity away from African producers to non-African collectors. Now, what I was then doing is, how does the canon impact recognition of existing works? How can African collectors be seen as people who are engaged in significant practice that is not in any case different from the other practices that we're looking at in terms of the canon? Several things became obvious as I started to do this work. One of them is this very interesting thing about the Akisera collection in Nigeria, is that I found out that he collects objects of quite potent, numinous force, according to Yoruba religion. And in that culture, owning these kinds of objects marks you as somebody who is engaged in esoteric practices, even when you don't, engage in those practices. And this object on the screen is one of those. On inspection, it was found to actually contain very disturbing, elements that were used by the diviners to make it an object of great force. Literally, one of these elements is this powder that is very acidic and very poisonous. If you touch the powder and then you touch your lips 3 days later, you die in a week flat. These are all the elements that these objects had, that gives them the kind of charge that we ascribe to them, but are actually part of a very structured scientific process of knowledge management in indigenous culture. The other one is the hand behind the screen, which is seen quite clearly here, that when we end up with a book like this, there is always this, we tend to not make it quite plain that the book was produced. Literally, it was made. And the making of a book like this, books like this are rival technologies of experience for art that are actually quite important, in the transformation of indigenous cultural objects into art. And the process that follows also became something of quite significant interest. Photographs are very central here. They are fetish objects, in essence, that allow us to actually, reinvest objects with different kinds of meanings from the meanings they originally have. It is an item of faith in this field that you cannot do a book of this sort without having extraordinary photographs. That photography process then becomes quite central to the discussion. I am showing this slide mainly to illustrate what I was saying earlier about my family's, archive of indigenous objects. But you'll be interested to know that in 2001, some thieves broke into my family's shrine house and cleared out all these objects. They are now, circulating in the nebulous world of African art. I'm still looking forward to the day I'm going to walk into a gallery and see my own title staff, for sale. I'll be able to recognize it, but how am I going to be able to prove that it's mine? So. What I did ultimately in looking at this collection is to map my process. I mapped my entire process of engaging the collection. All the intermediate steps, that went into the production of this book was actually documented in the act of writing the book itself and included as part of the narrative. The analysis of provenance of the objects, which involves significant historical research. The formal processes of converting a bunch of artworks into a viable collection, which involves, registering the works. This is Jennifer Schansberg, who is an art registrar that I flew in from Washington, D.C. to handle the registration of the works. She came up with the formal numbering system of the works, did all the preliminary documentation and all that. This is Peter Mathias of the Museo d'Arte e Scienza in Milan, who was flown in to do the authentication protocols Matthias runs a lab in Milan, that does authentication protocols for artworks. And he took samples from 80 of the artworks and then went and checked them. We got a sequence of, possible dates from those samples, spectroscopic analysis, and then incorporated that into the hierarchy of value of the artworks, which is to know which ones are immediately scientifically provable as being older than newer ones. And then I got a photographer to photograph the artworks according to current conventions of visual representation. In pointing about the role of photographs here, I'm insisting on their role as fetish objects that play such a role in the transformation of African art that it's quite easy to understand that in illustrating these works in catalogs and co, sometimes it is actually the represented work, the photographed work, that becomes a subject of discourse rather than the actual sculpture itself. Many of the people who work on these objects don't actually end up seeing the sculptures that they deal with. And this is the same thing for art everywhere. Valuable art tends to be not circulated quite widely. Now, Wendy Grossman's excellent publication on Man Ray lays bare how the current protocols for framing African art objects was developed. She states that photographic techniques of lighting, framing, camera angle, and cropping can radically alter perceptions of interpretations of objects. It's important to note that without the transformation of these artworks effected by studio photography, we might actually still continue to have African artworks disregarded as significant objects. These photographs of African sculptures by Thomas Feist are from the Matthias Kommer archive from the Getty Research Institute. Matthias Kommer was a major dealer in African art who used three different modernist photographers to produce alluring images of African sculptures that he then sold to prospective clients. And the photographers, you can see in the photographic archive, experimenting with different kinds of photographic representation to get the best protocols for showing these works. And this is another sculpture from that Como archive. These are obviously very poor photographs, but the originals are much better than this. So in dealing with the works that I was dealing with, in addition to that photography, I was obviously interested in tracking as much information of the collection history as possible. And all this information was also included in the book, the dealers who sold the work to the collector, his interaction with them over a period of time, the amount of money he paid for them, all these things were documented in order to have as much information about these works as possible. And the issue of the photographs as comparative representation, the images on these ones here are the photographs I took myself for my basic research project when I first encountered the collection. These are the final professional photographs that were published in the book. And I did an experiment where I sent different versions of these pictures to a lot of different people, including art appraisers and scholars, and almost invariably, the photographs I took myself were considered to be quite dubious in terms of their, and the professional photographs were, never argued with. Oh my God, this is great. How did you get this? So it sort of reminded me of something I encountered in my teaching African art history, which is that when I start teaching my students about the arts of the Ashanti and Ghana, where a lot of the artworks were made out of gold, there is really never any question in their minds that this is great art. It is made out of gold after all. What else can it be? So the issue that's relevant here then is, the photographic process that was developed early in the 20th century to represent modern art in the museum context was a very particular kind of photography. And my question is, how has the normalization of a particular way of seeing through a particular mode of photographic representation that has a definable history that is tied to modernism and an emergent advertising and mass media protocol, how did this become the premier mode for representing African sculpture? It is arguable that this mode is also transferable and has affected photographic representation of artifacts within the museum context in all spectra of the museum. But it is interesting that it worked in tandem with the art historical validation of African cultural production to actually create a sense of canonicity for African art. And this is another example of that kind of image. The Gelede mask here and the photograph that I took of myself. Obviously, the professional photography shows the works off, in a very, very different way. I was struck by something the collector said when I showed him the first set of professional photographs, and he said, it's as if I'm seeing the works for the first time. He was really very, impressed by that. So, all of this point to something that's very significant. One is that the canon of African art is completely untenable. There's no possibility of avoiding that conclusion. It does not mean that the canon is useless or that the constituent works are illegitimate. That's not the claim I'm making. But that the process by which these works were canonized is something that needs to be brought into question today. And it needs to be looked at very critically because this has a very great impact on the ability for African culture to assume their rightful place as a historical culture in the issues that concern African art history. What we normally get is that African culture is shoehorned into this timeless space. This is a space that does not have continuity. It's just a singular space where it's always an ethnographic present of some sort, and the artworks, that were collected in 1920 somehow magically represent cultural practice in the 1980s. Now, as I said, there is a lot of work that's going on in the field to understand the contemporary transformations of these artworks and their relationship to the older canon. But the questioning of the older canon itself is something that is always studiously avoided. And part of the reason for that, of course, is if questioning a canon, brings us back into that old problem of looking at African art as primitive works that do not have any sort of contemporary relevance to narratives of historical development. But I think this needs to be done because the issue of Benin bronzes, becomes the most staggering injustice, if one wants to put it that way, of an example of this kind of issue. That 100 years of cultural production of bronzes in Benin are not able to be considered as significant products of Benin art, even though these bronzes were made by descendants of the same bronze casters who made the original bronzes. The really interesting thing is that the Guild of Bronze Casters in Benin have lived in the same quarters in Benin City for 500 years. The people who are casting bronze in Benin City today, to become a bronze caster in Benin, you still have to go and formally be accepted into the guild. And it's still a guild made up mainly of family members who have very significant relationships with the older guild masters. So how can you have a body of work that's being produced by the same set of people or their descendants in the same location that they've been working for in over several centuries, but then you have 100 years of that whole body of work completely dismissed as not being relevant to the question of African, art canons. There are other issues that arise from this, which I'm not going to go into in great detail. But the key thing that comes out of my writing this book is, for me, a personal satisfaction in actually making the case that there is a much larger body of work that we're not looking at, and we should be looking at, with great seriousness. It is a work that's situated completely within art history, as I understand it and as I've practiced it for the past 2 decades. And I'm hoping that it will allow us to get back to talking about, the canon without worrying about destroying what we have created over these past few years. Thank you very much.